Atari is far from the gaming juggernaut it was in the 70s. This company has a long and rocky history that we won't get into right now, but in the 70s and early 80s, they were known for putting out arcade hits. Recently, there is a current revived iteration of Atari that's been attempting to revamp their older titles. There's been some inconsistent successes in the form of the Centipede and Yars Recharged games. On the chopping block for this treatment is a full modern successor to Atari's once popular Sprint arcade racing series, aptly titled Neosprint. Welcome back to I Dream of Indie Games, and in today's full review, we're going to see if Neosprint will have you rushing for the finish line or leave you with a flat tire. Before we hit the ground running here, if you're enjoying I Dream of Indie Games, you can help us continue to create indie gaming content by joining our Patreon, liking and subscribing to the channel, or hang out with us on Twitch live streams that we broadcast every Thursday. Your indie gaming community is waiting for you. Sprint is a top-down racer originally published in 1978 via arcade systems. It was actually one of the more popular arcade titles at the time, but really kicked off with Sprint 2, which introduced AI-controlled cars, as opposed to the usual predetermined track-controlled cars in Sprint 1, as well as other arcade races at the time. Sprint 2 also introduced multiplayer, so this really made it a popular arcade title. The gist of the game is to race around the track and avoid other cars in order to make it in first place. There's also obstacles to avoid that ramp up the difficulty on multiple tracks. So given that Neosprint is a modern successor, it follows that we will see a lot of the same concept, and we do. We race from a top-down perspective against AI-controlled opponents and avoid obstacles. Tracks get harder as we go along, and we can change out our car if we want to use one with different stats. And that's basically the whole premise of the game. It's a basic arcade-style game through and through, so there really isn't a story to speak of. There are various game modes, and included in these game modes is a campaign. A blurb for the campaign mode says something to the effect of, "Race through an amazing story." Well, if there is an amazing story, then the devs forgot to write it in because there's really no story, at all. The campaign mode is basically a series of short cups of 4 races that you have to race through and get the highest placement as possible. The only story bits you get are short, one-sentence nonsense in the form of final challenger racer at the end of a cup. These short bits amount to nothing more than the racer saying something to the effect of, "You'll need to try harder to beat me," before you race them, and then, "Oh no, how'd you beat me?" after you race them. These final challengers act essentially as final bosses. This is a missed opportunity to really modernize the game. They could have had a short story mode, adding more story bits to the overall campaign. These bosses, to some extent, give almost a Pokemon gym leader vibe. Why not go the route of an RPG-inspired racer for the campaign mode? Honestly, with a lot of modern games shoehorning in RPG mechanics, I would say having a racing game with RPG-light mechanics would be pretty novel. Nothing really builds out the world or the campaign mode. The only thing that makes you feel like you're progressing is the rewards that you get after races, which are done in an almost gacha-esque style. I don't know why that's needed in a game like this, personally. You do unlock some cosmetic for your cars and racers, but these aren't really noticeable since you rarely see your racer, and the car's not often seen in great detail due to being top down. So again, no story to speak of. However, we are offered various game modes to choose from. Aside from campaign mode, we have Grand Prix, Obstacle Course, Free Race, Time Trial, Multiplayer, and Builder. Aside from Builder, these other game modes don't really change up the main gameplay formula, which sees you racing around the track, accelerating and drifting to avoid opponents, obstacles, or take tight turns. The controls are pretty simple, which is a plus for an arcade racer. You'll basically just be holding down the acceleration button and braking to drift when needed, while steering with the analog stick, of course. Every so often, you might need to reverse or use the safety button to quickly reset if you're stuck. Because the game has a fixed camera perspective, the devs were nice enough to include a position indicator button, which helps point out where you are in case you lose yourself in the fray of other racers when playing in the more zoomed out tracks. In general, you'll mainly be using 2 buttons most of the time, with simple and quick button inputs for other actions should you need them. Neosprint is not going for a simulation racer at all, and honestly it succeeds in the control and overall gameplay loop. So the game may control well and feel good to play overall, however the implementation of these gameplay mechanics are a mixed bag. Let's examine the obstacle course mode first. This is an overall okay mode. I feel some challenges are harder than others because, well, the game actually offers a challenge there. A lot of Neosprint is pretty easy, especially in the campaign mode. Obstacle course sees you racing against time on a track littered with various obstacles like cones, fences, and oil slicks. These obstacles are designed to slow you down or veer you off track. In the case of cones and fences, when you hit them, you not only get slowed physically, but you also get a time penalty. Time trial mode also sees you racing against time, but without any obstacles. Essentially, in this mode, you're racing against a shadow version of yourself and trying to get a better time. Riveting, I guess? Free race and Grand Prix modes are a bit more interesting. Free race allows you to race on unlocked tracks freely with as many racers as you want, and you can even adjust the difficulty of the AI here for some extra challenge. You have the option to add obstacles to the courses as well. Free race also allows you to browse user-created tracks. You can search them directly, look at recently uploaded tracks, or search through the highest rated tracks, dubbed most wanted in the game for some reason. Grand Prix allows you to run through slightly longer cups. The nice thing here is you can actually create your own mix of tracks, which includes user-created tracks as well as your own created tracks. For all these game modes, you'll be racing against AI opponents only. Did you know that the original Sprint 2 was the first racing game to use AI-controlled cars? Before that, racing games had opponent cars drive on predetermined patterns. It was actually a big thing of praise back in 1978. So, given that for most of Neosprint you'll be racing against AI, how does it fare compared to those older games? Well, the AI is hit and miss. Sometimes you'll see a CPU cut you off during a drift in a very clever way. Other times you'll see it get stuck in a reverse, accelerate, crash into a wall loop, and you can just drive past them. The AI never really got that difficult, even on the harder difficulty settings. Maybe it was just a car I was using, but I doubt it. At times, the AI does move like it could be a real player. Other times, it clearly gets confused. So, there is a multiplayer option. It's local multiplayer only. We were not able to test this during the review period, but it should work similarly to the original arcade. That is, players race on the same track in a singular view. Basically, the screen isn't split screen, you're racing all on the same map. You can actually play up to 8 players in multiplayer, which is neat. The game at release will allow for remote local multiplayer as well, so you can get kind of an online multiplayer adjacent experience, but currently there's no online multiplayer option. This type of game would benefit from online multiplayer greatly. Imagine playing some of the harder tracks with others or taking on obstacles with a cluster of other cars. Imagine racing against not only your car's ghosts, but also other players during a time trial. I also feel Neosprint is prime real estate for a 99-like battle royale game mode, or at least some type of crash mode or battle mode. Right now, it's an arcade racer with really none of the more modern arcade and party game design. The game mode offerings do feel classic and true to form for the Sprint series, but why not modernize it a bit more? I surely hope some of the more modern game design options I suggested are included after release. At the very least, some form of online multiplayer would be appreciated. There is a build mode that keeps things fresh. Build mode is probably the best mode to mess around with. In some ways, it reminds me of Mario Maker, and in other ways, it reminds me of Excitebike. You can essentially create any track you want as long as the pieces fit on the grid. So you can make some really interesting winding tracks with a ton of loops and right angle turns, or you can make off-track jumps or sudden drops. As long as you can actually complete a lap on the track, then you're allowed to build it. Dealing with the grid can be a bit finicky though. Some of the pieces, depending on the shape, are confusing to fit in the small squares on the grid. Spacing essentially takes some time to get used to due to the fixed camera angle. You can change the camera angle up a bit as well as change the track level, and this helps sometimes. It takes some practice, but isn't game breaking by any means. I did accidentally delete some pieces by hovering over a placed track I didn't realize I was hovering over due to that fixed camera angle. Furthermore, the menu for picking track pieces is weird to navigate. It's more of a hotbar style, and that hotbar disappears when you aren't switching track pieces, so you don't always know which track category you have selected. The menu controls are a bit clunky too. They aren't the worst, they just feel weird at first. You switch the track piece with the triggers and switch variations of the track with the Y button, and then you change the angle with the X button, something like that. If they want the hotbar options, I'd prefer a simple scroller. Better yet, a circular menu might be better. But all in all, the build mode is probably the best mode, albeit a little limited right now. It would be cool if you could have your own challenges in the levels or add in your own custom win conditions, but currently that doesn't exist and ultimately limits the building and sharing experience quite a bit. The game does look okay. I mean, it isn't bad by any means, but it's also by no means great. Neosprint doesn't really try to go for a neo-retro aesthetic. It goes for a very safe aesthetic. In some ways, the art style reminds me of Roller Coaster Tycoon Classic, with a somewhat textureless, vaguely cartoony art style that is pretty subdued. But in general, it looks pretty generic. Think of something that you'd expect in a mobile game. The car models are good enough. They kind of look like Hot Wheels. In fact, the camera angle kind of reminds me of Hot Wheel tracks or slot racer tracks. Some of the colors and patterns pop nicely, which is good, so they're more noticeable given the zoomed out camera. The character models are pretty generic, but you won't really be seeing your character. The audience members pasted around the tracks don't really look like they're standing on the ground sometimes. I'll say overall, the art style is somewhat toy-like. I don't know if this was intended. I kind of wish they did go for a more neo-retro art style. There is an Atari track theme that you can use in build mode, and this particular theme is beautifully modern retro and aesthetic and is oozing with neat neon colors. This is the nicest track theme. Maybe the winter track theme comes in second place for me. There are some advertisements you can use as decoration for your tracks. These are billboards with logos for old games. They're okay, but again, generic, often just going for a basic logo for an old Atari game with no other effects going on. Outside of the track, the surroundings and backgrounds feel static, which just makes the game feel even more generic. Also, when you win a cup in campaign mode, your driver will hold up a trophy. This is basically the only time outside the selection screen when you see your driver. The animations here look so weird. Sometimes your driver will awkwardly hold up the trophy in a weird stilted looped animation. The drawings for the boss racers were okay, but again, generic. There are a few camera options as well. You can have the total top-down camera mode or have car-centered camera, and I thought the car-centered camera would be a sort of third-person camera mode, but it's just the camera panning with your car rather than the entire track top-down. I actually preferred the car-centric mode over the total top-down camera mode. Speaking of generic, the soundtrack is littered with a few generic songs. I wouldn't think twice if I was told that there was only one music track, honestly. The music tries to go for an 80s synth vibe, but it isn't really punchy, fun, or high energy as synth music can be, nor is it chill and dramatic as other synth tracks channel. It sounds almost like a Fisher-Price toy jukebox playing synth music. Nothing about the music in Neosprint is indicative of retro games either. It's painfully generic. Sound effects are okay overall. I mean, I didn't expect this game to have in-depth audio cues or sound effects since it's clearly not going for an in-depth simulation racer, so the sound effects are forgivable here. The music, less so. Also, the pitiful crowd sound, which is tantamount to one or two people yelling, "Woohoo!" when you win a cup, is just sad. It makes me feel like I won the local boxcar race at my church basement teen center during a rainy summer in small town Illinois. Alright, so overall, the best way to describe my experience with Neosprint is generic. I was actually excited for this game. I like the OG Sprint, and I want modern Atari to succeed, but games like this just don't spark confidence. Why no online multiplayer? Why no in-depth game modes? Why is there a gacha-esque collection mechanic? Why aren't there different terrain physics depending on the track style? The game plays okay, but there isn't much of a reason to keep playing the game. Maybe I'll jump on at release and see the crazy tracks that other users build, but then I'll remember I can't play these tracks with other people, and due to limited creation tools, even the custom tracks are bound to feel samey after a while, despite the great amount of freedom the game does give you to use these tools. I hope at release there are improvements to all these issues, but overall, this game is just feeling mediocre.